The Jewish question. So I want to start this off from where I started my journey on this topic. You see, I'm Jewish, my family is Jewish, and I don't think you can grow up really in America at all without hearing about all these, crazy conspiracy theories like 9/11, dancing Israelis, the USS Liberty, Jewish space lasers and the Rothschilds and things like that. And I've always kind of wanted to hand wave these away because it sounds like you're talking about lizards to me. It sounds like you're talking about aliens, one of those crazy rabbit hole internet conspiracy theories. But I'm also a really curious person, and I never stop looking into any topic until I feel satisfied that I've gotten both the detractors and the proponents of any theory's full message. I've spent time doing that here with this regarding this topic and really Jewish culture at large. The world and media are so heavily propagandized and everybody knows it. So to take what any media spokesperson says at face value is just like stupid. And you need to spend time researching both sides of every argument, and you need to go through the argumentation. A big reason why Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk were so successful is because when some young kid approaches them on stage with some surface level gotcha, right? It's like, you think Ben Shapiro's like, wow, I've never heard that one before. Like, no, he's prepared. He knows the rebuttal, and you don't. And when you come away from his rebuttal with like this attitude of, well, he's just wrong, when he just provided you with some information that you don't have a response to, you shouldn't be coming away with that with like, oh, he's just wrong, like I'm gonna keep thinking the way I think even though I was just presented with some kind of counter argument. Like, do you really know what you're talking about unless you can defend it? So you can't get to any like real idea about what's going on without digging really hard. And regarding the Jewish situation, you can look up really any of these conspiracy theories and you'll see the first 10 results are like from Jewish organizations and they say everything is a anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, right? So what's the deal here, right? Like, I don't want to just hear from Jews why Jews aren't bad and everybody else is just wrong, So let's, without further ado, let's get into it. History and influence. The ancestors of Jews were a small scavenger people along the Fertile Crescent, and they were surrounded by all sides by various Levantine superpowers. And the Levant is the single most invaded region of the world in world history. Jews, again, were a small people, so they had to, survive through subtle means as opposed to being extremely, warrior-based. Practicing a prescriptive ritualistic theocracy allowed for extremely strong social cohesion. They would survive through various subjugations of their people by keeping a very strong group identity. Jews became known as a problem people by their occupiers, as they were likely to revolt due to messianic prophecies about reconquering Israel and their Messiah coming, as well as they were less likely to assimilate due to the previously mentioned ritualistic theocracy. Of course, famous examples all throughout history, but many of the Roman revolts led to the Bar Kokhba revolt in 130 AD. That led to the Jewish expulsion from the Roman Empire. During the Jewish diaspora directly after the Roman Empire expulsion and genocide, Jews settled in various foreign nations. They settled in walled-off communities with very little interaction with outside communities, and they were almost a totally urban culture. Much of the later communist creations of Jews were a reflection of the Jewish ghetto. And say what you will about communism, it's generally seen as a successful model on a small scale. For example, the family unit itself is a communist model. This isn't to say anything about how it works on a large scale. We've seen throughout history what happens there. The Jewish religion, Judaism, is an interpretive law-based religion. And the keys to practicing the religion come with argumentation. The ruling class was the priestly class, so in order to rise up through the hierarchy, you had to be good at argumentation. Now, a quick aside on the Talmud here. A lot of people like to point to the Talmud and some of the nastier sections in the Talmud as some kind of Jewish binding law Jews have to follow. And to a degree, they do follow some of it, but it's an argument between rabbis starting after the Old Testament. And it's, almost 2,000 years of this argumentation. A lot of people like to point to a section in the Talmud as an example of Jewish sort of racism and such. And I can't remember off the top of my head what the section is called, but essentially the section says that any Gentile who is studying the Talmud should be put to death, that he has sinned. However, the very next rebuttal from a rabbi says, no, as a matter of fact, any Gentile studying the Talmud is holy and should be considered on the level of one of our priests, right? So it is argumentation, and, it's interpretive. Maybe some Jews agree with the nastier stuff, maybe some Jews agree with the sort of more positive stuff. The thing is, though, is that the Talmud isn't so much, people shouldn't look at it like it's some kind of binding law and do this thing where oh my God, look what the Jews said. Look what they said in their little book. It's a better example for Jewish racism towards Gentiles. And, Jewish racism historically, I'm not going to make a morality claim to whether it was good or not. I mean, every single historical culture was racist and self-interested, right? That's all cultures throughout history. And when you're some Jew in a foreign country 1 to 2,000 years ago, you're going to group up with your people and try to wrest power from what you perceive as your occupiers, right? Or probably were your occupiers, just flat out. So I'm not going to make a morality claim there. However, the modern age is different, right? And the thing is that Jews, they have this historic racism that is strong, and the Talmud is a great example of Jewish thought throughout the ages to those who weren't Jewish. Jews were not a warrior-based culture. They were a culture that was always sort of situated in another culture. They had to learn to thrive based on the resources and systems of other cultures. This would lead to what some would call a parasitic-like, behavior. But the thing is that, necessity is the mother of invention, right? A lot of the framing around Jews is that they were either innocent scapegoats used by various countries as some kind of perfect little, they were just being used, they were sweet, it's all lies, Or people say, they were evil, nasty, they were using everyone and everything around them, but the reality is somewhere in the middle. It's a push and pull between self-interested cultures throughout history. The problem is that Jewish history up to this point has led to a Jewish diasporic ethnic nation with strong in-group preference that is able to utilize social and economic tools to a high degree. This has led to the modern situation in which monarchies died off in the 1800s and the systems that Jews thrived in became commonplace globally. Now that we've entered somewhat more modern times, I have to make this disclaimer. When referring to Jews with agendas in the future, I'm mostly referring to a fanatical minority of elite Jews that have agendas. The difference is, and the thing is that, even, the Jew down the street, Bob, he doesn't necessarily have an agenda to overthrow Western civilization. However, the history of Jews, as I've outlined, leads to apolitical Jews without agendas to support the ones that do have agendas. Lenin famously said that any intelligent Russian is either a Jew or has Jewish blood. And this is just one quote among many of elite Jews having this sort of racial tension with Gentiles. The Rothschilds. The contemporary Rothschild family history starts with Mayer Amschel Rothschild. Mayer was born in 1744 in a Jewish ghetto in Frankfurt. He got into financing young, and he rose to become the German royals' financier and banker. After he established his bank in Germany, he sent his 5 sons off to 5 cities in Europe: Vienna, London, Naples, Paris, and Frankfurt. They established their own banks and banking empire throughout Europe. During the Napoleonic Wars, Nathan Rothschild funded Lord Wellington's army in Britain, and Jacob Rothschild funded Napoleon in France. Since the Napoleonic Wars, Rothschild family members and banks have funded both sides of multiple conflicts. An international banking system has been well known by historical scholars to be an instrument of wealth extraction. Thomas Jefferson is quoted saying, "I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling the futurity on a large scale." The Rothschilds are also guilty of keeping it all in the family on a Habsburg level. There's many publications outlining just how incestuous the family is. But essentially, Mayer set forth a rule that only his male heirs would be allowed to inherit any of the wealth. So this highly incentivized the women of the family to marry back in. Only about 3 women and 2 men in the Rothschild family have married outside the family. There's a lot more to this story about banking establishments. You can watch the Zeitgeist documentaries. The first documentary sort of outlines in the beginning section how the Rothschilds are likely behind JP Morgan and the Rockefellers in America as well. While the Rothschilds nowadays have moved on to sort of food and natural resource investment, Jewish financing and investment is still an issue today, which we will cover. The Bolsheviks. Marxism started as a solution to the Jewish question. In Das Kapital, Marx refers to capitalists and sort of like their agenda. However, they're basically interchangeable with the word Jew. And on the Jewish question, Marx is talking about Jews, and he outlines all of their behavior and their agendas the same way he does with capitalists. He views the way that capitalism goes as inherently a Jewish problem, seeing as how Jews, as outlined previously, had to thrive on, economics and social tools in the countries they were in. Marx thought that the dissolution of borders, of race, of religion, as a solution to the Jewish question. It would naturally lead to the end of the Jewish diaspora and their need to utilize the tools that they did in order to maintain and gain power. This is why communism is generally a Jewish invention and generally was pushed by and created by a cadre of Jews. They were looking to end the Jewish diaspora, and this was their solution. If you research the Bolshevik Revolution, it is often reported as a bloodless revolution of the working class versus the capitalist monarchy. There's always little mention of Jewish involvement, and in fact, on Wikipedia's article, Jewish Bolshevism, it refers to the idea of Jewish involvement in the Bolsheviks as an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. It also mentions the idea of overthrowing Western civilization to be an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The thing is that's exactly what Marx wrote about, right? Hell, even Jordan Peterson mentions the communist authoritarians' goals to overthrow Western civilization. There are quotes on the matter. He'll quote Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn's works, yet conveniently leave out the fact that Solzhenitsyn himself wrote a book 200 years together about Gentiles and Jews in Russia. And he was charitable. He wanted to unify the Gentiles and Jews, but it outlines the situation that was in Russia. It wasn't a revolution by Russians for Russians. The Bolsheviks were a minority party in Russia, and they were heavily invested in by foreign interests. Oftentimes they'll say that Germany, invested in the Bolsheviks because they were interested in the Russians leaving World War I. But there were also financial investments from Wall Street and London, all over the world, really. During the 1904 Russo-Japanese War, Jacob Schiff, a Jew who headed up the Kuhn Loeb Company investment firm, he provided war loans to the Japanese. Now, thousands of Russians were taken prisoner, and Marxist propaganda was printed and supplied to these prisoners. Following the abdication of the throne, Jacob Schiff, according to a New York Times article, stated that he wished he had, been there for the revolution in person. It is exceptionally well documented, the shadowy networks behind the Bolshevik Revolution, how it wasn't a majority party and it was heavily financed by international interests. Now, the Bolsheviks disproportionately were made up of Jews. Jews made up less than 4% of the Russian population. The entire party was not Jewish, but much of the top officials in the party were. Not only were these top officials Jewish, they were also immigrants. They were not national Russians. Winston Churchill is famously quoted saying, "This movement among the Jews is not new. From the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky in Russia, Bela Kun in Hungary, Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and Emma Goldman in the United States, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development, of envious malevolence, and impossible equality has been steadily growing. The link between Jewry and Bolshevism, the Judeo-Bolshevism of Hitler, is provided by the leadership of the Russian Revolution, with the notable exception of Lenin. The majority of the leading figures are Jews. Moreover, the principal inspiration and driving power comes from the Jewish leaders. Thus, Chicherin, a pure Russian, is eclipsed by his nominal subordinate, Litvinov, and the influence of Russians like Bukharin and Lunacharsky cannot be compared with the power of Trotsky or Zinoviev. After World War II and the Holocaust, Western media, developed a bias against highlighting Jewish involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution. This, however, was well known by scholars, researchers the world over beforehand. A few months after the coup, the new government made anti-Semitism illegal. Now, Joseph Stalin was not Jewish and has stated much of what I have here. Not an endorsement of Stalin or anything, but just another data point to why the Jews were treated the way they were after he took power, why they instituted pogroms and all this. The Bolsheviks did not hang on long after Stalin took power, and so we move on. Weimar. So as many people know, after World War I, Germany was utterly kneecapped by the Treaty of Versailles, but I cannot understate just how bad it got for the Germans. Germany was held responsible for the war and was subject to penalties. They had to pay off the debts of the Allied countries, and they suffered economic and military restrictions. This led to massive inflation and very poor conditions for Germans. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion German notes. At one point, over 40% of Germans were unemployed and many were homeless. In one 2-year period, so many Germans killed themselves that it outnumbered the number of American deaths in World War I. As inflation went up, foreign buying power went up. At one point, 1 trillion German notes was worth $1 American. So foreigners flocked to Germany to take advantage of the situation. Many Germans moved into urban areas, such as Berlin, to look for work. But unfortunately, really one of the only jobs that was available was prostitution. Prostitution was so prevalent that on any given night in Berlin, over 100,000 women would line the streets looking for their next John. They were lined up according to their body type, how pregnant they were. You could find mother-daughter pairs if you liked. And of course, men were a part of this as well. You could find young men, little boys. Pimps would sell people anything. You could get animals. You could order all of this over the phone. Sexual torture acts were also prevalent. You could pay to harm somebody so absolutely as to kill them. Drugs were also heavily prevalent. You could get cocaine from a doctor's prescription, and amphetamines and opium were readily available. The drugs were so often used that they became part of sexual drug experiments. Now, many of these sexual drug experiments were performed at the Institute of Sexual Research, started by Magnus Hirschfeld, a Jew. Now, little has been told about Magnus Hirschfeld up until this present day, due to the way our ideologies in America have gone. But he was essentially the father of our modern sexual progressivism. He performed one of the first trans surgeries. He also established a system of non-binary genders, with his list having 16. And much of the foundations of sexual progressivism that we have today in the West comes from the Sexual Research Institute. The Institute housed a library full of books on sexual progressivism. They also had a museum of sex. Both of these were reportedly visited by school children. Magnus Hirschfeld was gay as well. And you can look him up, you can find all of these examples of his degeneracy and his sort of thought process regarding sex. Many of these themes were heavily represented in the art and film industry. Moreover, the communist inclination of the Bolsheviks was heavily present in film, working class versus authoritarians, all that stuff. Now, the big problem here is that these industries were run by Jews. Jews ran the nightclubs, they ran the brothels, they ran the printing press, the news, they ran the theater, film industry, arts, music. By 1933, 60% of films in Weimar were produced by Jews, and 80% of the film scripts were written by Jews. Many of these films, of course, were, on sexual progressivism, heavy sexual themes, this kind of thing. Jews made up less than 1% of the German population, yet held positions in all the top industries. The 1919 German Constitution was written by a Jew, Hugo Preuss. 1/4 of the Council of the People's deputies were Jewish. 22% of the Social Democratic Party were Jewish. But not only were they 22% of the Social Democratic Party, they also held the top positions. The main political thinker of the party was a Jew, Edward Bernstein. The vice president of the Berlin police, Bernhard Weiss, was a Jew. 15% of the German parliament were Jews. The infamous Frankfurt School was also primarily ran by Jews, and it was there to push Marxist propaganda. Willy Munzenberg, one of the most fanatical from the Frankfurt School, is quoted as saying, "We must organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink. Only then, after they have corrupted all its values and made life impossible, can we impose the dictatorship of the proletariat." These are the issues that were identified by Hitler and why it was possible for the Nazis to take power. Not endorsement of Hitler, of course. The Germans were poor, and international Jews held the elite positions in Germany. Not only did they hold the elite positions, but they weren't benefiting the German people, right? It's not like the Treaty of Versailles kneecapped the Germans and they were just in this situation and that Jews came by and they were just, creating porn and selling drugs and prostitutes and that's fine or something. They were contributing to the social degradation of the Germans. They were feasting on these people. They were engineering social degradation, as a foothold to overthrow Western civilization. Now, you may have whatever opinion you might have on, trans rights and homosexuality, but you can't deny the level of degradation that the Weimar Republic got to. With the porn industry, Hollywood, and media now headed up by and heavily invested in by Jews in America, one wonders, does this sound familiar? I mean, Solomon Friedman, a rabbi, is the ethical director at ECP, the parent company of Pornhub, Brazzers, YouPorn, RedTube. It goes on and on. When the Nazis took power, they burned books, right? Take a guess what kind of books they burned, because they didn't just burn all the books in Germany. It wasn't just, oh no, we got to burn these books. They burned the sexually perverse books that were written by Jews. When growing up, I heard about the book burnings often, with people saying, how could you burn books? This is the first sign of fascist dictatorship. I read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury when I was a kid, which kind of looks into the future of a society that burns books, right? And it's like, it's so horrible. But what is going on today? Mark Zuckerberg famously spoke about how the Biden administration put pressure on him to censor conservatives. So where's all the people that were upset about the book burnings and yet okay with all this censorship of a supposedly free speech-based society? That's a lot of burned books. Zionism, AIPAC, and the ADL. The Jewish desire for a nation state stretches all the way back to the Roman expulsion, almost 2,000 years ago. But the modern formulation starts with Theodor Herzl, who generally agreed with Hitler. Hitler agreed with Zionism, right off the bat. They thought the solution to the Jewish question was Zionism, in contrast to what Marx was saying. Instead of dissolution of borders and all this and race and everything, instead they thought if we give Jews a land and put them there, and they have the right to be there, and you expel them out of all the other countries, then they will have their own nation that they will have to fight for, and they will just assimilate with the global situation as a nation. Now, I sympathize with this, as I also see this as the simplest solution to the Jewish question. However, as history shows, in the interest of this agenda, Jews have subverted nations using money and politics and other tools, intelligence agencies, blackmail, genocide, you name it. So in the modern situation, the Marxists and the Israelis' interests have converged into a rules for me but not for thee situation, where they push these open border, radical diversity, policies in other countries, but in their own country, they're very nationalistic, and it's ridiculous. No one can deny the influence Israel has had on America through a multi-pronged approach. They use the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, AIPAC, or the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or, intelligence agencies, with Mossad being the most well-known to the public. AIPAC is a lobbying organization that basically says they're for all things Israel. AIPAC was formed when JFK instructed their precursor organization, the AZCPA, or American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs, to register under FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act. FARA requires organizations registered with them to disclose where all their money is going, where it's coming from, so it makes foreign actors transparent. The AZCPA pushed back on this, saying, in a chain of letters with JFK, that they were afraid that if they registered under FARA, that the American public would not support them, would have an adverse reaction to them. JFK, of course, still put pressure on them to register, and after enough pressure, they just disbanded the AZCPA and created AIPAC. They thought that AIPAC would get around JFK. I'm not sure why. JFK then told AIPAC, of course, that they need to register under FARA. Now, AIPAC says, oh, no, all our funds are coming from American sources. There's no international situation here. yet they remain opaque. They won't mention where all their money is coming from. After JFK died, Lyndon B. Johnson, the vice president and then acting president, lifted all restrictions. He said, no, it's fine. You don't have to register under FARA. So AIPAC has been acting since then, not under FARA and completely opaque. Now, AIPAC has famously bragged that they've spent more money in American politics than any other lobbying organization. An article for The Intercept outlines this, titled, "How Does AIPAC Shape Washington? We Tracked Every Dollar." Quote, AIPAC has spent money on more than 80% of the 469 seats up for re-election this year. Ahead of the 2024 cycle and amid growing public outrage over Israel's war on Gaza, AIPAC made a bold pronouncement. Through its United Democracy Project arm and AIPAC's PAC, it would spend $100 million on elections, about 1/6 of what outside groups spent on the 2020 presidential election. There are few congressional races that AIPAC sat out this year. Of the 469 seats up for re-election this year, AIPAC has spent money on more than 80%. 389 races in total. AIPAC has sought influence over 363 seats in the House and 26 in the Senate. Of the 389 candidates AIPAC funded, 57 did not face a primary. Of the primary elections that did take place, 88 candidates had no opponent. Thomas Massie, a Kentucky congressman, has recently come under fire from AIPAC, with them spending over $400,000 in statewide smear campaigns during his last election cycle in an effort to, as he would put it, keep him in the position he is now, no running for governor or anything like that. He has been famously anti-Israel, rather anti the war in Israel, and he's been anti-Israeli money in politics. He stated that AIPAC has an appointed representative to sit and lobby in every single Republican congressman's office. A big part of my objective here is to help everyone else know how to research. I highly suggest opensecrets.org. You can go to opensecrets.org to follow money in politics in all sectors. If you go to the congressperson page, you can look at what the top donors are for each congressman. And wouldn't you have it, you go looking and perusing through that section, you'll see that the top contributor to the majority of these candidates was AIPAC. I would say, though, be mindful under the foreign actors section. You will not see AIPAC, of course. As previously mentioned, they did not have to register under FARA, and that section only covers FARA-registered organizations. Moving on to the ADL. The ADL formed in late 1913 when a Jewish man, Leo Frank, was charged with the raping and killing of a young girl, Mary Fagan, 12 years old. And they formed because they said he was innocent, essentially. They blamed, and his lawyers blamed, a black man, John Connolly, a night janitor, for this heinous act. Now, the case took place in a Southern court, and the white Southerners believed the black man over the white passing Jewish man. Right? Isn't that kind of funny? After he was charged, he was sort of like his death sentence was commuted, and he instead was sentenced to life in prison. A gang of white men came and broke him out of prison and lynched him. They saw this as like a miscarriage of justice. This is how the ADL formed in response to this case in order to help Leo Frank. While I won't go too into depth in the case and its details, it's highly disgusting. It is a heavily disputed case to this day. And while Wikipedia says generally historic scholars agree that John Connolly was actually the perpetrator of this crime, it is heavily disputed. And I urge you to look at all the evidence and make a conclusion yourself. The ADL is responsible for much of the anti-Semitism accusations against people who criticize Israel. And not only that, but they have been shown to create these fake hate crimes, these hate crime hoaxes, time and time again. A couple examples. In February 1979, someone by the name of James Gutman applied for a permit to the National Park Services to hold a Nazi rally at the Independence Mall Historical Park. Now, there was an uproar in the news about this, so several journalists decided to investigate the matter. Well, it turns out James Gutman was actually Mordecai Levy, a man working for the ADL, who was looking to raise funds for the organization. Mordecai Levy later split off and created the Jewish Defense League. A couple years ago, the ADL was claiming there was an up-and-coming National Day of Hate. Oren Siegel, vice president of the ADL's Center on Extremism, told the Forward, quote, "It's essentially a hodgepodge of white supremacist organizations, many of which engage in on-the-ground activity like flyer distribution, banners, protests, that sort of thing." Now, no one ever showed up to any National Day of Hate rally, and the only claims of any kind of National Day of Hate, come from Jewish organizations. If you look on Google for anything about this National Day of Hate, it's all claims from Jewish organizations. There's no Facebook group, there's no Discord, there's nothing. There's a lot more of these. You can go to fatehatecrimes.org for more information on really any of these. But essentially, there's a lot of these. And matter of fact, Jews have been caught over and over again, spray painting swastikas in their neighborhood, or being some kind of liar. Like they'll say, like there's a particular gentleman who created a whole story about his surviving the Holocaust while he was never there, right? So, and as he put it, it's because he was looking to create attention for the Holocaust still. He didn't want anybody to forget. And again, there's tens and tens of incidents where Jews will spray paint swastikas or something like that to make people think there's some kind of anti-Semitism scare. Wikipedia has recently come under fire from the ADL, who sent a letter to Congress saying that Wikipedia has over 8,000 editors that are looking to change the narrative surrounding the Israeli-Palestine war. This is super ironic, considering the ADL trained 12 of its staff members to use pseudonyms and edit Wikipedia articles. Wikipedia does not allow organizations to edit their own articles. However, the ADL continues to edit their own article and get away with it. And there is a discussion page on Wikipedia where many editors are concerned over this. ADL editors will put in, ADL approved sources, make ADL approved edits to their pages and various other pages. Intelligence agencies and Epstein. So I think almost everyone can and has accepted that the CIA does not act in the interest of the ordinary American. But it's not just the CIA, although that is the most highlighted intelligence agency due to its interest in proxy warfare, its interest in South America, JFK's famous opposition to it, along with several other things. There are so many declassified documents and bits of information revealed to us over the last 80 years due to great investigations by journalists that you can kind of just pick and choose. Some examples: the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, where they took 50 black men and gave them syphilis and did not give them the cure or let them know about their condition so they could experiment and observe them over a 40-year period. The CIA being exposed by Gary Webb in the 1980s for dumping cocaine into inner city neighborhoods, and then Gary Webb's subsequent suicide by 2 shots to the side of the head. The problem is the intelligence apparatus includes the CIA, the FBI, the DOJ, the DOD, and the State Department, along with other foreign intelligence agencies. The scope of their reach is unknowable due to them being heavily compartmentalized, meaning that one agent or asset only gives enough information to another agent or asset so as to complete their objective. They are also composed 90% of assets. An asset is just somebody that you have incriminating material on, or you can bribe them into doing what you want them to do. Those people essentially work for the intelligence agencies and again compose 90% of them. Now, the reason I outlined the CIA specifically is because it helps to illustrate the behavior of all intelligence agencies. With intelligence agencies, it's difficult to point to stories that happened 30 plus years ago and use them as examples of like, present offenses. So we're going to take a look at the Matt Gaetz scandal that happened just a few years ago. In early 2021, the New York Times broke a story saying that Matt Gaetz was under investigation by the Department of Justice. They were looking into reports that Matt Gaetz had had a sexual relationship with a 17-year-old girl. The case stemmed from an associate of Matt Gaetz, Joel Greenberg, who had been indicted for sex trafficking a minor. He named Matt Gaetz in connection with these activities. When this became public, Matt Gaetz went on TV and stated that his family had been the victims of an extortion plot by Israel, he said. His father, Don Gaetz, had been approached by some people demanding $25 million to free Robert Levinson. Robert Levinson was a Jewish American working with U.S. and Israeli intelligence to spy on Iran's nuclear program, and he got himself caught. In exchange, these men who were extorting Don Gaetz said that they would make the case against his son go away. There are public texts leaked between Jake Novak, the ambassador at the Israeli consulate, and Scott Adams, the guy who made Dilbert, I guess. Jake Novak was heavily involved in the attempt to free Robert Levinson. The text exchange goes like so. This is screwing up my efforts to free Bob Levinson. I've got a commando team leader friend of mine nervously waiting for the wire transfers to clear. Gates's dad was secretly funding us. And we only asked for $25 million as an estimate at first. We came way down. Now, with Epstein, I've been following the Epstein case for damn near 10 years at least. When I was a kid, I read about Epstein maybe like in 2014 or so. It was in 2014 I read about Epstein, right? And long before that, when I was like 14 myself, so about 16 years ago, I read about his island on 4chan of all places. They were just like yapping about it on that website. And I don't want to outline everything with Epstein. I'm only going to give some details because I think everybody knows who he is at this point. But the particular details I'm going to mention are sort of the most damning and most interesting facts and the reason why people suspected what they did about Epstein even 10 years ago or so, Okay, first though, we have to cover Ghislaine because that's the thread that ties Mossad to Epstein. Now, Ghislaine, her father was Robert Maxwell. Robert Maxwell is relatively uncovered in the media space. If you look him up, you're going to see that he's just like a British mogul. Rather, those are like the first bit of headlines, They really don't talk about him. They talk about Epstein, they mention Ghislaine, but they don't mention her father. Robert Maxwell was likely tied to Mossad. And the usual hand wave is that there's no declassified documents that state strictly that he was working for Mossad. If you remember what I said about assets, it doesn't really matter. You don't need to be strictly working for them in order to do what they want you to, or work in both of your best interests. What we do know about Maxwell is that he was Jewish and he supported Israel's ambitions. He was a media mogul. And if you know anything about the media space, it is heavily infiltrated by intelligence. Voice of America was essentially the propaganda arm of the CIA. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty are both documented as being ran and funded by the CIA. Maxwell owned many news publications under his media empire, Mirror Group newspapers. He owned many publications throughout Europe and the US, and those papers were pro-Israel. Journalists from the Daily Mirror and the Sunday Mirror documented how Maxwell would intervene to soften or kill any news article that was going to come out that was anti-Israel. Maxwell met with Israeli leadership often and was treated with high respect. In the 1980s, we had the Promise scandal, in which the US and Israeli governments were, distributing this software. It was a case management software that allowed courts to track intelligence across jurisdictions. The US and Israel acquired their own copies of this software and installed backdoors that leaked data back to the previously mentioned governments. Robert Maxwell has been implicated as having been a salesman for this software. The software was distributed to 40 different countries, many of them being adversaries of the US or Israel. After Maxwell's death in 1991, his funeral was attended by 6 former Israeli prime ministers, and Shimon Peres had said at his funeral that Maxwell had done more for Israel than can today be told. Maxwell was later buried in Jerusalem, which is extremely high honors. All of this is for just like an international Jewish businessman. Maxwell's death today is still speculated on whether it was an accident, it was perhaps suicide or murder. Maxwell at the time had been, found to have essentially directly after his death a year or so later, the British government found out he had been stealing his employees' pension funds, and his companies, they were highly leveraged. He didn't have very much money, and he needed money basically. And the theories all say something like, "Oh, he was asking for too much money from the Israeli government or something like that." At that point, it's just speculation. But his daughter, Ghislaine, definitely inherited his connections. And so we trace back to Epstein. So with Epstein, like I mentioned before, there's so much there. People already know about his connection to the CEO of JP. Hello? So again, with Epstein, there's so much that other people have already covered, like his connection to JP Morgan Chase's CEO, Jamie Dimon. There's a special relationship, just like Les Wexner as well, the LV Brands creator and owner. And, their special relationship and chilling in the hot tub. His connection to former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, who has been seen going into meetings with Epstein many times. And in fact, there's pictures of him entering one of Epstein's mansions like 10 minutes after 4 really cute young girls entered. He's like covering his face with a mask. So, there's just so much there. But the most important thing is the not so nebulous facts, right? So let's get down to it. In 2005, the Palm Beach Police Department was informed that Epstein had paid for sex with a 14-year-old girl. They investigated this and found that multiple underage girls had been paid for massages. After seizing items and phone records from Epstein, the department referred the case to the FBI. The FBI identified at least 36 underage girls who had been involved with this. By 2007, Epstein's legal team, including Alan Dershowitz, one of O.J. Simpson's lawyer, and also had the finger pointed at him by Virginia Giuffre along with Epstein, were negotiating with, the prosecutors. Alex Acosta was the district attorney prosecuting the case, and he approved a sweetheart deal for Epstein. Then they dropped all federal charges against him and immunized him and co-conspirators from any further prosecution. Epstein was sentenced to 18 months in county jail. His cell was in the private wing, and it was furnished better than other cells. He served 3.5 months and then was granted work release, where he was allowed to leave his cell for 12 hours a day in order to work. His own chauffeur would pick him up and drop him off daily. He served 13 of the 18 months and was granted release. Now, I don't know that Epstein was specifically a Mossad agent or that his ties to Ghislaine, mean that he was specifically Mossad. It's very possible he was working with multiple intelligence agencies and was, working for the highest bidder. He would acquire material and give it to the, whoever paid for it. Maybe you'd put it on eBay or something. So yeah, again, I don't know that he's Mossad, but it's more like an illustration again of how intelligence agencies work and the kind of immunities these people get. 2007 is when Epstein went to prison for apparently, trafficking 36 young girls, and he served 13 months in a cushy prison where he could just leave and come back. Who is this guy? Why did they give him that? And why was he allowed to walk free after that and continue his blackmail sort of business? So, there's more with Epstein. Everybody knows that. Prince Andrew, his connection there, and Virginia Giuffre, as previously mentioned. But it's more of a reflection of the intelligence agency situation, and Epstein is always named in connection with Mossad, so I thought he might be a good person to cover here. Israel. So we're going to start basically at the beginning of the modern situation with Israel. And, first we have to talk about the population of Israel. And, before it was Israel, I should say the population of Palestine. And the best way to highlight the fact that there was an indigenous Palestinian population is to quote the founders of Zionism's thoughts on that population, right? Because everybody gets this idea that it's an uninhabited desert, or it was rather, with like a couple farmers or something, and Israel just came in. It's not what happened. An article from Haaretz outlines early Zionist leaders' thoughts. Quote, Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism, wrote in this diary in 1895, "We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries, while denying it any employment in our own country." David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, saw population transfer as a key point of the plan and added, "With compulsory transfer, we would have a vast area for settlement. I support compulsory transfer. I don't see anything immoral in it." And in 1940, Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote that the world has become accustomed to the idea of mass migrations and has become fond of them. Hitler, as odious as he is to us, has given this idea a good name in the world. While this predated the final solution, it is surely still a terrible indictment. One of Herzl's colleagues, Israel Zangwill, after visiting the Holy Land, stated, "We must be ready to expel them from the land with the power of the sword, as our forefathers did to the tribes that inhabited it." Directly after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was addressed to Walter Lionel Rothschild, by the way, as he would fund the British war effort in exchange for the land, the British and the Zionists started dispossessing Palestinians. When the British mandate for Palestine began in the 1920s, the British and the Zionists started doing land purchases and mass migrating into Palestine. While the British allowed for Zionist state-based organization to happen, they actively suppressed any Palestinian organizing for statehood. Between 1936 and 1939, Palestinians organized into the Great Arab Revolt, which was brutally suppressed by the British and Zionists, and they killed thousands of Palestinians. In 1948, Israel declared independency, and the Nakba followed directly after, from Wikipedia. During the foundational events of the Nakba in 1948, about half of Palestine's predominantly Arab population, around 750,000 people, were expelled from their homes or made to flee through various violent means, at first by Zionist paramilitaries, and after the establishment of the State of Israel by its military. Dozens of massacres targeted Palestinian Arabs, and over 500 Arab-majority towns, villages, and urban neighborhoods were depopulated. Many of the settlements were either completely destroyed or repopulated by Jews and given new Hebrew names. Israel employed biological warfare against Palestinians by poisoning village wells. By the end of the war, Israel controlled 78% of the land area of the former Mandatory Palestine. In 1956, the Suez Canal was nationalized by the burgeoning Egyptian government. It had been operated by the British and the French, and following the Egyptian Revolution, they wanted to take control of it. So the Egyptians wanted to. In response to this, Britain and France launched an attack on Egypt, and they used Israel to fabricate pretext, allowing them to invade. Israel said they had been attacked by some Egyptian forces along their border. Now, at the time, the American political stance was to have balance between the Arabs and the Jews. And so they pressured Britain and France to stop attacking them. America put a lot of pressure on them. This was such a big deal and was so humiliating for Britain that the Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned. Now, JFK and Ben-Gurion, the then Prime Minister of Israel, had a very tense relationship at the same time that JFK had been beefing with the AZCPA. Israel was developing a nuclear program with the help of France, and it was in America's interest to keep them from developing a nuclear weapon. JFK required Israel to allow us to inspect their nuclear facilities and make sure they were maintaining nuclear reactors and not nuclear weapons technology development. Israel, having the interest in developing a nuclear weapon, built fake facilities and built fake walls in their facilities. They walked our American inspectors through the facilities, and it was a big runaround, and our intelligence knew this, our agents knew this. In 1963, JFK sent a letter to Ben-Gurion telling him that if Israel did not open their facilities up and let us inspect twice a year, that we would end all aid to Israel. Conveniently, the next day, Ben-Gurion resigned. So they managed to avoid JFK's request, and after they had elected a new prime minister, he also gave JFK the runaround, and JFK did not live much longer. When JFK died, as mentioned before, Lyndon B. Johnson took the office, and when he took office, he ended all this inquiry into Israel. He, anything... Remember, I mentioned about AIPAC. What a joker this guy was. He also tripled the aid that we were giving to Israel. In 1967, Israel launched a surprise attack against Egypt and its allies called the Six-Day War, where they took Gaza, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. In 1973, Egypt, Syria, and their allies launched a surprise attack as well back on Israel, and they called this the Yom Kippur War. The attack was so effective that Israel was warning us essentially that they were going to use a nuke. They didn't outright say this, but they took their nukes out in such a way as to show U.S. intelligence that they had them and they were willing to use them. This is called the Samson option. This wasn't some light threat, right? The U.S. had been backing Israel and the Soviets had been backing the Arabs. Should this go off should Israel nuke the Arabs, this might end up in World War III just because of the alliances that we have. So in response to this threat, the U.S. started dumping weapons and munitions to Israel, and they successfully repelled the attack. This set the stage for the creation of the neocons that would then go on to infest Bush's cabinet and Clinton's cabinet before him. the Israel First Republicans. In 1978, the Camp David Accords was agreed to by the US, Israel, and Egypt, and it was a peace treaty. Troops withdrew from all the borders, and a consequence of this was that Egypt became the second highest funded country by the US. In 1972, an article published in Kivinum, now referred to as the Oded Yinon Plan, outlined a strategy to disrupt and topple 7 countries. Those 7 countries are the 7 countries we've seen toppled, with Iran being the last one over the last 40 years. The article said that the Arab nations were a house of cards just waiting to fall. It also talks about their objective to dismember Egypt. Noam Chomsky writes about this as taken from Wikipedia. Chomsky cites in support of David Ben-Gurion's strategy when the State of Israel was founded of crushing Syria and the Transjordan, annexing southern Lebanon while leaving its northern residue to Maronite Christians, and bombing Egypt if it were to put up a resistance. Chomsky warned against complacency about these fringe ideas, since, he argued, the entire history of Zionism, and later that of Israel, particularly since 1967, is one of gradual shift towards the positions of those formerly regarded as right-wing extremists. Israel Shahak, a leftist Jewish political thinker, referred to this article as a completely accurate representation of the strategy being pursued by Ariel Sharon, the at the time Prime Minister of Israel. Now, why did Chomsky say right-wing extremists? Well, this is because Irving Kristol, a Jew, famously said that the neoconservatives were leftist Jews that had been mugged by reality after having seen the wars going on in Israel and the American public's perception of it. Irving Kristol was the godfather of neoconservatism, and we would, as I mentioned, later go on to see Bill Clinton and George Bush's administrations full of neocons. An article from former CIA political analysts Kathleen and Bill Christensen says, quote, "In the Clinton administration, the 3 most senior State Department officials dealing with the Palestinian-Israeli peace processes were partisans of Israel to one degree or another. All had lived at least for brief periods in Israel and maintained ties with Israel while in office, occasionally vacationing there. One of these officials had worked both as a pro-Israel lobbyist and as director of a pro-Israel think tank in Washington before taking a position in the Clinton administration, from which he helped make policy on Palestinian-Israeli issues. Another has headed the pro-Israel think tank since leaving government." And from the same article regarding Bush's cabinet, the neocon strategy papers half a dozen years ago were dotted with concepts like redefining Iraq, redrawing the map of the Middle East, nurturing alternatives to Arafat, all of which have in recent months become familiar parts of the Bush administration's diplomatic lingo. Objectives laid out in these papers as important strategic goals for Israel, including the ouster of Saddam Hussein, the strategic transformation of the entire Middle East, the death of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, regime change wherever the US and Israel don't happen to like the existing government, the abandonment of any effort to forge a comprehensive Israeli-Arab peace or even a narrower Palestinian-Israeli peace have now become, under the guidance of this group of pro-Israel neocons, important strategic goals for the United States. The enthusiasm with which senior administration officials like Bush himself, Cheney, and Rumsfeld have adopted strategic themes originally defined for Israel's guidance, and did so in many cases well before September 11th, and do the so-called war on terror, testifies to the persuasiveness of a neocon philosophy focused narrowly on Israel and the pervasiveness of the network through policy-making councils. If you look through all of these different neocon strategies, their goals have remained the same for the last 40 years. When 9/11 happened, our country targeted Afghanistan. Now, everybody knows about the conspiracy theories, Osama bin Laden's connections to the CIA, stuff like that. The thing is, whether or not the conspiracy theories are right, the official narrative just doesn't make sense, and you can pick it apart based on its own, model. Oftentimes, events like 9/11 are used by the greater political scene to push their agendas, whether or not somebody in the government started it or not, or were responsible for it or not. They still will use it for their agenda. According to the official narrative, 9/11 was conducted by Al-Qaeda, the leader of which was Osama bin Laden. The countries the terrorists came from were Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, and Lebanon. The US claimed that Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were headquartered in Afghanistan, and so we invaded. Directly after that, we invaded Iraq. Now, why did we invade Iraq? There's no connection between Iraq and 9/11. None of the terrorists came from those countries, and the terrorists weren't headquarters in Iraq. We were there because the agenda to topple Iraq is in the neocons' strategy stretching back 40 years, whether they were terrorists in the modern day or not. In 2002, Netanyahu, in a video on C-SPAN, said that regime change in Afghanistan leads to regime change in Iraq, which leads to regime change in Iran. Now, this was 1 year before we invaded Iraq. An article from Times of Israel also shows, quote, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tells I-24 TV News that he feels he is on a historic and spiritual mission, and that he is very attached to the vision of the Promised Land and Greater Israel. The interviewer, Sharon Gall, who was briefly a right-wing member of the Knesset, gifts to Netanyahu near the end of their interview what he says is an amulet of a map of the Promised Land. This is my vision, says Gall. He jokes that he does not want to further entangle Netanyahu in the case against the premier for allegedly receiving jewelry and other luxury goods from several businessmen for him and his wife Sarah, but also says he would like Netanyahu to give the amulet to Sarah. Thank you, says Netanyahu. Do you connect to the vision? Gall asks Netanyahu. Very much, the prime minister replies. Really? Asks Gall. Very much, Netanyahu repeats. It is Greater Israel, Gall stresses. If you ask me, we are here, responds Netanyahu. He then pauses and continues. You know, I often mention my father, my parents' generation had to establish the state. And our generation, my generation, has to guarantee its continued existence. And I see that as a great mission. He then moves on to discuss the sense of mission among Israelis today, highlighting that sense of purpose among soldiers, including reservists and their wives. The amulet itself does not appear on the screen. The exchange is cut from the video of the interview posted by I-24 on its YouTube site in Hebrew, and does not appear either in a shorter version of the interview on I-24's English YouTube site. It appears on I-24's own Hebrew website, beginning at 31:14. Each of the countries targeted by the neocons and their strategies have been regime changed or toppled. The Oded Yinon strategy foretells exactly what happened. Israel's occupation of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, its encirclement of Gaza, the invasion of Lebanon, the bombing of Syria and Iraq, and now they're targeting Iran. Israel has no interest in a peace deal with Palestine. They do not want a two-state solution, and they will not agree to a two-state solution. Netanyahu confirmed in a video in 2019 during his corruption investigation that the Israeli government, had been funding Hamas as a countermeasure to the Palestinian Authority. He said, "We control the height of the flames." They had been allowing all kinds of weapons into Hamas. They'd been literally sending them funds. And the reason for this is because as long as Hamas is in control, they're a terrorist organization, and Palestine cannot and will not be recognized by any European country or NATO country as a actual sovereign state. The Palestinian Authority was the burgeoning government for Palestine, and if the Palestinian Authority were to wrest control from Hamas, they could create a government and so be recognized as a sovereign state by the rest of the world. On September 9th, 2025, this year, as of recording, Israel bombed Qatar's capital, Doha, targeting Hamas diplomatic leadership. They had met to discuss an active ceasefire presented by the U.S., as Qatar is one of our longtime mediators in this situation and an ally of the U.S. And the attack killed Hamas members. However, it also killed Qatari security and Qatari civilians. Lightning round. In the American financial sector, Jews are also overrepresented in pushing their agenda. Everybody knows BlackRock and its CEO, Larry Fink. Larry Fink is not just Jewish, he is also a staunch Israel First supporter and has funded many arms deals to Israel over decades. Another 5 of the top officials at BlackRock are Jewish as well. Larry Ellison, the world's wealthiest Jew and second wealthiest person in the world behind Elon Musk, has funded the IDF on the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. And he's also ran some Jewish organizations. He is the owner of the company Oracle that hosts all of the data from TikTok, so that way the Chinese don't hold on to it. And he also recently purchased a large majority share in TikTok. The reason for the acquisition has nothing to do with, the government's fear of Chinese data holding, considering the fact that Oracle, an American company, is already hosting all of the data from TikTok. Okay, so the Chinese don't have it. The reason why they currently acquired the stake that they did is in order to shut down and censor any anti-Semitic speech on the platform. And as of this recording, they've already sort of done this, and you can't look up anything anti-Semitic on TikTok. It provides you with like a Holocaust education thing. So yeah. Larry Ellison also funded Marco Rubio's presidential campaign in 2015, and Marco Rubio is a known neocon war hawk. He is now the Secretary of State and pursues aggressive pro-Israel war support. Larry Ellison is also a close friend of Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu asked Larry Ellison to purchase a media company operating in Israel that was critical of Benjamin. Larry Ellison also requested Benjamin to sit on the board of Oracle for him. However, Netanyahu did indeed decline the offer. David Ellison, CEO of Skydance, is looking to merge Paramount Plus with Warner Bros. And him and his father both supported Bari Weiss, putting her in charge as the CBS editor-in-chief. She is also an Israel First Jew. Bari Weiss interned in Israel with the IDF as well as with multiple Jewish organizations in Israel. Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York and media mogul, has donated millions to Israel. Sheldon and Miriam Adelson have donated close to $200 million to the IDF, as well as Miriam Adelson donated $100 million to Donald Trump. The two founders of Google and current majority shareholders in Alphabet, Google's parent company, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, are both Jews who have donated millions of dollars to various Israeli organizations, as well as they provide strategic AI, military services, cloud services to Israel. They work with the Defense Department in Israel. Michael Dell, the founder of the Dell Company, has donated close to $2 million to Israel. News media is also largely headed up by Jews. New York Times, Huffington Post, and many such publications are primarily headed up by Jews. Comcast, the largest cable provider, is also ran by Brian L. Roberts, a Jew. Comcast owns NBC Universal, Vox, BuzzFeed, and many such others, and has donated millions of dollars to Israel. On the right-wing side, we have Rupert Murdoch, who owned Fox News and Newsmax. He was a loud advocate for Israel and frequent donator to Israel. He's good friends with Benjamin Netanyahu, and they meet with each other regularly. In academia, 5 out of 8 of the Ivy League schools have a Jewish president, and much of the neoconservative recruiting happens out of these Ivy League schools. Peter Thiel is oftentimes referred to in this. J.D. Vance as well. A lot of the neocons come from the Ivy League schools. This is just a lightning round. I could spend hours naming rich Jews in all sectors and really drawing the net here. I haven't even mentioned Hollywood and the music industry and who's up there, But just look at Michael Jackson and Kanye West's battle with the music industry, and or like Mel Gibson's battle with the Hollywood Jews, There's so much there. I'm not going to cover it here. Maybe a future video. So in short, U.S. politics has been infested with Jewish leftist Marxists and Israel first neocons on the right-wing side. The neocons are interested in us funding and fighting wars of aggression for them. And there is a congruency in our story. As I mentioned previously, the neocons used to be Jewish leftists. We still have Jewish leftists running amok in our schools. The highest level of intellectual is equated with like a Marxist in academia. The original neocons were Trotskyists who felt mugged by reality, and the ones not living in Israel generally still have the same views they did for much of the Western world, but just not for Israel. There is a thread of the Jewish intent and desire to subvert nations through history. The modern right of return allows for a transnational identity that supersedes their home country identity. Yes, other countries have, their own goals and they spy on us, and, they have their own intelligence agencies, China and Russia do, right? But the public knows this and the government resists this. We hear about Chinese, Russian, and American propaganda all the time. However, the Jews are allowed to run theirs with no problem. The hypocrisy is unreal. I mean, now Trump wants to deport foreign students who are critical of Israel, while also wanting to bring in 600,000 Chinese students next year, even though Chinese students have been found to be spying on us and taking secrets back to their country over and over again. This is a story of generations of wealth, of intelligence and media, of a culture's desire for security and the depths they will stoop to achieve it. What is the similarity between Marx, Hitler, and Benjamin Netanyahu? The desire to free Jews from this cyclical history has been the background for some of the largest and most destructive moments in history. I want you all to notice how I didn't mention conspiracy theories too much, or rather cover them too much. And, the reason for that is because there's so much verifiable, documented information regarding this situation that you don't need the funny little conspiracy theories to fill your head with. And a lot of the time, some of them are just absolute nonsense, and you're doing yourself a disservice, because the problem of Jewish power is a real problem. But if you're out here like, oh my God, Israel killed my dog, like nobody's gonna fucking listen to you, right? So you need to be, you go on TikTok and you scroll and you see every little Jews are evil meme, maybe second guess it. Maybe don't just like repeat it ad nauseum. There's so much fake stuff out there. And again, there's verifiable history. Just go over that. And if you don't want to go over that, refer back to this video, just refer back to this video, send it to other people. This is the one-stop shop to get red-pilled on the Jewish question, So that's it for this video. I look forward to making videos on a variety of topics, and also covering stuff surrounding this a bit more as well. If you found it informative, send it to a friend, send it to a family member, send it to an acquaintance. Actually, just send it to some guy you don't even know. You know what I mean? And if you found any value in the video, you can tip me down below. I put a link in the description to some kind of thing you can donate to me. I haven't figured it out yet. Also, I've put a lot of sources in the description, so please go over those sources. I know a lot of it can look rather esoteric. You're like, is this hieroglyphs I'm looking at? It's like, no, dude, it's a government website. You just gotta like peruse it, okay? Anyhow, enjoy yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.